Good morning, wise women. It's our pleasure to bring forth the speaker today, Dr. Fran Coan. And we want to make just one announcement that one of our very favorite longtime wise women, Carol Diamond, has passed away, and you'll read all about that in our next newsletter. Today, we'd like to turn it over right now to Margaret Mitchell so that she can introduce you more fully to Fran Coan. Thank you so much. Don't forget the questions.
Well, again, welcome, wise women. We're so happy you can join us. And as Barb said, we're delighted that we have Dr. Fran Coan with us today. Fran is a faculty member at Tunxis Community College. He's an historian. He's also written about military issues. And in particular, he's focused on 20th century American history. So today he's taking one of those areas, the Prohibition movement, the 18th Amendment, and everything that happened leading up to that and afterward, to give us a picture of what that event was like and what preceded it, what came after and during. So I'll turn it over to Fran. Again, welcome, Fran.
Thank you, Margaret, for the warm introduction, and Barbara. And thank you, Sean, behind the scenes, for engineering this production. So hopefully everything will go smoothly. And thank you to everyone who is watching, or perhaps will watch this after the fact. So let me see if I can go into my PowerPoint. And actually, I'm going to back up just a step here. Here we go. All right. I'm going to back up to the beginning. There we go. Okay, now we're ready to go. So, the road to the 18th Amendment, Temperance and Prohibition in America, 1820 to 1920. Yeah. Everyone of any age, I suppose, in the United States can know something about Prohibition, the 1920s. And certainly we all learn about it in school, certainly in high school. But what's less known, I think, is the movement that preceded national prohibition. And that's really what I want to focus on today. How did we get there? How did the 18th Amendment come to be? And it's a long, long road and a long history, and it's an interesting history. So that's what we're going to focus on, the events leading up to the national prohibition of the 1920s. So let's start by looking at colonial, revolutionary, even early national America. And this quote is from a book by an historian, William Rohrabaugh. It's actually a chapter in that book, A Nation of Drunkards. So the point he makes, and other historians have made, is alcohol usage was ubiquitous in early America for a number of reasons. One, people understood that water was often contaminated, it was dangerous. Even though there was not yet an understanding of how disease was spread, there was some understanding that water could lead to illness and death. And that they brought from England, actually, too, where there, too, the water was often tainted. So people didn't typically drink water, they drank alcoholic beverages. Two, medicine and alcohol were synonymous in that there were so few treatments for things. Often alcohol was used for those treatments, and actually it was touted as being beneficial to health, not harmful to health. Three, if you consider the number of calories in alcoholic drinks, it was an important part of people's diets, actually. You know, they got a significant number of calories from these alcoholic beverages. And then four, as you see in this painting, and this is still true today, obviously, alcohol is a social lubricant that's used in all sorts of social events and important life events, such as births, deaths, marriages, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and so forth. So people drank, and they drank prodigious amount. And I'm going to show you some statistics in a minute. And we're not only talking adults, we're talking children, we're talking old people, men, women. You know, alcohol usage was ubiquitous. So this is from Rohrbaugh, actually an article he did back in the 70s, where he tried to get at how much alcohol per capita Americans consume. And this would have been 1810. So this is per annum consumption of alcohol per American over 15 in 1810. And again, this is a year. So cider was the most, and this would be hard cider, the most consumed alcoholic beverage, the 30 gallons per person. Distilled spirits, early in the period, we're talking mostly rum. That was the distilled spirit of choice. By the early 19th century, by about 1810, it was becoming more whiskey than rum. 8.7 gallons, again, per person. Beer, 1.3 gallons. Wine, about 0.4 of a gallon. Wine being more often the better off classes in America, not so much the poor. So the total is, it's over 40 gallons of liquor per person, over 15 per year. And if you break it down, it's over 14 ounces a day. So it's just an incredible amount of alcohol being consumed. Well, what to do about this? In that people did realize this could be a problem. People got drunk. People did start to see a correlation between excessive use of alcohol and poor health. There were obviously other problems we will talk about, such as the effect on families, such as the effect that drunken men had on women and children. So a key event in leading to the rise of the temperance movement would be this great religious revival that would sweep the United States, the Second Great Awakening, roughly the late 18th century to the mid 19th century. And this is a whole history unto itself. Many of you are probably familiar with it, at least broad strokes. But you certainly had an enormous upsurge in the Protestant churches in America, particularly the Baptists and the Methodists. They become the predominant sects, Christian sects in the United States during this period. Largely speaking, the message is an appeal to emotion more than reason. It's to move people to be concerned about their faith and their fate in the afterlife also. Personal conversion is at the heart of this too. What's made possible in most of these religions is the possibility of salvation simply by choice. And that's available to everybody. That although it would differ from church to church, sect to sect somewhat, generally speaking, the idea was to repent one's sins, to embrace Christ, and to lead a godly life. And at that point, one is saved. Now, saving oneself was just the beginning, though, because in all of these churches, there was an evangelical spirit, which required them to go out and save other people. And that they saw would be difficult because they saw an America replete with sin, with temptation. So the Second Great Awakening would also give rise to a whole series of social reforms, which had a religious impulse. Abolitionism would be a very important one. Women's rights would be intertwined with this, prison reform, institutional reform, but also temperance. So certainly the temperance movement and also prohibition were intertwined with American Christianity. The sense that particularly excessive alcohol usage leads to temptation and sin and is socially destructive, and hence we have to do something about that collectively. And that's what many Americans would set out to do. So the rise of the temperance movement, it's the early 19th century. Certainly the 1820s is really where it starts to get a lot of traction, a lot of support. And again, a lot of reasons for this. One, the sense that Christians had that alcohol use, drunkenness leads to the loss of free will. meaning one is more prone to temptation and sin and destructive behaviors. 2, social control. It's clear this was in part a class struggle. The better off classes trying to control the working class and the poor. And related to that is what I call middling class respectability. It's also a way of separating oneself along class lines. So what became not respectable, certainly in public, was to be drunk. But that was particularly true among the professional classes, if you want to call them the middling classes. And that was a way to separate oneself from the working class, from the masses. And then certainly part of temperance too was nativism. You definitely have a split along ethnic lines. Old stock Americans against particularly the folks who had started arriving in the 1840s and after. The 1840s, we're talking the Irish, the Germans. And also you have a religious split here in that the vast majority of the Irish and some of the Germans at least are Catholics in a country that's still overwhelmingly Protestant. So the fault lines of temperance run in a few different ways. But again, the goals largely are social control of some sort. It's to prevent people from engaging in sinful behavior, whether they want to or not. And it is largely the better off classes trying to impose their will, not only on themselves, so to speak, but on the working class, on the poor. I put Lyman Beecher's photo in here from Connecticut, famous minister, because he was very much an advocate of temperance. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a quote from a sermon he gave in 1826. Our institutions, both civil and religious, have outlived that domestic discipline and official vigilance and magistrates which rendered obedience easy and habitual. The laws are now beginning to operate extensively upon necks unaccustomed to the yoke, and when they become irksome to the majority, their execution will become impractical. To this situation we are already reduced in some districts of the land. Drunkards reel through the streets day after day and year after year with entire impunity. The mass is changing. We are becoming a different people. So what he's pointing out is, in his view, and in the view of many who supported temperance, drunkenness had become a bigger problem from years past, where it was controlled more locally, when people knew each other. And probably a generational difference here too. But now that's not working as well. So what can we do? Well, we're going to take action. We're going to do more. This is a pretty famous Currier and Ives illustration. It's called The Drunkard's Progress. And actually, Nathaniel Currier was a temperance supporter. And you see the 9 steps in the drunkard's life, from step 1, a glass with a friend, to step 9, death by suicide. So you see this gradual progression of man destroying his life. Now, the interesting part of this is under the arch here, you see the family, the impact on the family. So that's certainly at the heart of temperance also, the sense that the main target here is actually men. We're trying to prevent men from drinking, or certainly drinking to excess. But much of the impact falls on the family, the wife, the children. And we'll talk more about that, but obviously violence, abandonment, a man wasting money, particularly a working class man. He really can't afford to waste, perhaps losing his job, losing his home. So it's no surprise that women's rights advocates, early on even, many of them supported temperance because they saw those two issues as intertwined. The American Temperance Society was born in Boston in 1826. It was the first, at least important and influential temperance society. It was a group of ministers supported by a group of merchants, business owners, who came together and formed the society. But within the next 10 years in the United States, there were literally thousands of these societies. So this was very much a grassroots effort. And again, much of it was driven by the Protestant churches. Not all the Protestant churches, because there were some exceptions, but particularly Baptist, Methodist, Congregational, and others too. So what you see here is actually an illustration from a temperance book. It's really sort of a log of events from the Avon, Connecticut, or East Avon Temperance Society. Just happened to have this available and wanted to show you a little bit of it. You see the beautiful cursive script that will soon be completely obsolete in the world because nobody writes cursive anymore. It's a shame. And as an historian, we're actually going to have to train historians to be able to decipher cursive, sort of like, you know, deciphering linear B or something, or Latin. But regardless, here's some of the record of this temperance society. Again, it's just one of thousands that emerged within a decade of this original American temperance society. And here we have the Temperance Pledge, and that would have been at the heart of all of these temperance societies. And I'm going to see if I can pull that up on the screen. I don't know if you can see the whole thing here. Let's see if I can move my box. Here we go. Here's what it says. The Temperance Pledge is up here. We whose names are hereunto annexed do hereby agree that we will not use intoxicating liquors, nor traffic in them as a beverage, that we will not provide them as an article of entertainment or for persons in our employment, and that in all suitable ways we will discontinue its use throughout the community. So there's a lot to this pledge, but obviously first and foremost, these people are swearing not to use alcoholic beverages, nor traffic in them, in other words, buy or sell them, not provide them as an article of entertainment at parties and social events, or for persons in our employment. And believe it or not, in early America, there were cases where people were paid in part in alcohol. So they're pledging not to do that. And then the last part's important too, that in all suitable ways, we will discontinue its use throughout the community. So what they're engaging in is what's called moral suasion. They're trying to convince people to take this pledge, and not only take this pledge, but go out and get other people to take this pledge, and really put pressure on people in the community to stop using alcohol, stop selling it, stop producing it, stop serving it. And again, this is happening not just in Avon, Connecticut, it's happening all throughout large parts of the United States in the early 19th century. So you have a whole series of citizens who have signed this, and I'll just go on to the next page. It continues. I actually, go back. I actually counted the number of names, and it's 200. The whole population of Avon in 1840, this is from 1843, but the whole population of Avon was just 1,001 people. So this must have been almost every adult in the town at the time. And that was fairly typical. So moral suasion is, think of it as peer pressure. That's really what they're engaging in. They're trying to pressure others to support the temperance movement, give up the use of alcohol, and convince others to do the same. And that had some serious impact. But as we know, that doesn't always work perfectly. It's one thing to take a pledge, it's another thing to be able to hold to it long term, especially when nobody's looking. So along with moral suasion came what's called legal suasion, changing laws to, if not, actually going farther than temperance, actually now outlawing or at least restricting the sale and use of alcohol. So again, this did not begin in the United States in the 19 teens or 20s. This goes way, way back to the first half of the 19th century. So the architect of a law that would become introduced and actually passed in the whole series of states in the 1850s. You see him on the left. His name is Neal Dow. Very interesting character. He's a Quaker. So along those lines, he forswore the use of alcohol simply because of its religious beliefs. He was also an abolitionist. So he bitterly opposed the use of rum, particularly rum made from sugar, sugar produced by slaves. So he made those connections. It's absolutely against the use of rum. And he was also a nativist. So he despised these Irish, particularly Irish Catholics moving into Maine. I don't know if I made the point, he's from Maine, particularly in the 1850s. He would be mayor of Portland, Maine during much of the 1850s, actually a member of the Maine legislature. And much later in his life, he was actually the nominee for the Prohibition Party's presidential candidate late in 1880, very late in his life. So he would be the architect of a law in Maine that would prohibit alcohol use, production, sales, except for, quote, medicinal and mechanical purposes. So medicinal being doctors, physicians, that sort of thing. Mechanical, actually, most of the alcohol produced in the country was used for industrial purposes. It wasn't used for consumption. But what he's trying to prohibit, literally just end, is again, the production of sale of alcohol for consumption. And in 1851, Maine passes such a law, and very, very quickly, looking at the map, 13 of the 31 states by 1855 had passed such laws. This map isn't entirely accurate. I had to put little coffee cups on Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, because they too passed laws in the 1850s. And so did Connecticut, by the way. So in a very short span of time, you have this whole spate of states prohibiting alcohol, with some exceptions, but largely prohibiting. This is something I stumbled on when putting together this presentation. It's actually a propaganda piece by an organization called the Maine Liquor Law Statistical Society. It's a temperance, it's really a prohibition organization. What they did is interview a series of people who attested to the effectiveness, in this case, of the prohibition law in Connecticut. So it's a whole series of municipal leaders, the governor, I'll mention him in a second, religious leaders and so forth. And in every case, obviously, what they're doing is they're giving evidence to support this law because they see it as very, very effective. So this left-hand column is actually an interview with the governor of the time, Henry Dutton. He was the last Whig governor in Connecticut, and he was just a supporter of prohibition. So I'll just read you a couple of quotes where he's asked about legal suasion versus moral suasion. Again, literally just outlawing alcohol use versus trying to convince people not to use alcohol. We have found by practice that legal suasion is better than moral suasion. The latter is quite useless except with moral men. Well, there we go. When men are governed merely by appetite or love of gain, moral suasion has no effect. Legal suasion saves breath and labor and accomplishes the object in the simplest manner possible. So he's a big supporter of this law. And again, this is a whole series of interviews with people supporting this law. However, we know what happens when one outlaws a commodity, in this case, that is in great demand. It's not as if people stopped wanting alcohol in most cases. Many still wanted alcohol. From the get-go, all of these states had problems with, one, enforcement, and then two, also corruption, government officials being corrupt, people illegally trafficking in alcohol, smuggling it, illegally making it, what have you. And within just a few years, most of these states actually repealed these laws as unworkable. So by 1863, only 5 states kept these laws, including Maine, by the way, but most had gotten rid of them because they didn't work. They didn't work as they'd hoped. It created more problems than they solved. All right, but that's not to say people would give up on the idea of prohibition. There would be renewed efforts after the Civil War. And here are the 2 main organizations that would lead those efforts. The first would be the Prohibition Party, which was indeed a national party that had a lot of support at the state level, obviously, too. And then the second, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Both of these, what the Prohibition Party we'll start with, was what the term they used was narrow gauge. For most of their existence, they focused on this one issue, and they were reluctant to support or expend energy on other issues. You know, the issue was prohibition. They simply wanted, ultimately, a national prohibition of alcohol sales, use, and consumption. They didn't have a whole lot of success nationally. In 1888 and 92, they did win over 2% of the popular vote, which is significant, but obviously nowhere near enough to really exert any power. But they did have more success locally. And one thing they would push for is what's called the local option. So in state after state, they were able to convince the legislature to give county governments or municipal governments the power to decide the issue of prohibition, to restrict or not liquor sales and usage. And there they had considerable influence and success. The WCTU was to use the term, a broader gauge organization. They were certainly, as the name implies, interested in temperance and in prohibition, but they were also very much interested in women's rights, broadly speaking, the family. So on the left, you see the second president, long-serving president of the WCTU, Frances Willard. And she saw the temperance and prohibition issues as what she called home defense. Her concern was what alcohol use was doing to families, to children, to wives. And so she wanted laws passed to do something about this. The WCTU was also concerned about public health, workers' rights, labor reform, child welfare. So it was a broader gauge organization than the Prohibition Party. And these 2 organizations, for much of their existence, were antagonistic. They had different strategies, and they didn't always get along. I'll just throw in the woman on the right, who you may be familiar with, Carrie Nation, maybe the most famous member of the WCTU. In 1900, she began what she called her Hatchination campaign. And this wasn't authorized by the WCTU. This is something she did on her own. She believed she was called on by God to end alcohol usage by literally going into bars and saloons with a hatchet and destroying things. And that's what she did in a number of places. She'd be arrested about 30 times between 1900 and 1910. So she certainly got a lot of attention, but she was actually sort of disowned by the rest of the WCTU. They didn't really believe in that sort of direct action. So if we jump forward to 1890, you do see not so much states that were entirely dry, that had prohibition laws. That really hadn't changed a whole lot since 1860. But you do see the effects of what's called local prohibition, the local option. So in many states, including Connecticut, these groups were able to convince the legislatures to give, again, county governments, municipal governments, the power to decide, are we wet or dry? We do have to throw in the progressive there because there's overlap between progressive goals and the goals of prohibition advocates. And again, not to give you a whole history of progressivism, again, I'm sure many of you are somewhat familiar with the era, but the progressives, they're mostly middle-class professional people. They're concerned about divisions in America, social, economic, cultural, ethnic, and they're really concerned about America falling apart or going at it along those lines. So what they seek to do is address some of those social problems, many of them, a whole variety of them, in order to create a country more moral, just, cohesive, efficient. Sort of a very short summary of what progressivism was about. But some of the goals of the progressives overlap with the goals of the temperance and prohibition advocates. So certainly public health and safety. If you think of the Pure Food and Drug Act that Teddy Roosevelt would sign into law, you know, there's a lot of overlap there in terms of alcohol use. Concerns about the power of big business. Certainly temperance and prohibition advocates would attack what they called the liquor lobby that had a tremendous amount of power, selling things to people and over government too. And they were concerned about corruption. So the most successful prohibition organization of them all was this, actually, the Anti-Saloon League, which was formed in 1893. The founder, you see on the left there, Howard Hyde Russell, was actually a lawyer by training, had a religious experience, became a minister, and really threw the rest of his life into prohibition. Wayne Wheeler was a somewhat younger man that Russell cultivated, hired, and he was the great organizer of the Anti-Saloon League. And this was a classic grassroots organization that had just tremendous success in driving forward the issue of prohibition. So it's a people's army. It's mostly spearheaded by those Protestant churches, especially the Baptists, Methodists, and some others. Their goal is to drive the country one county at a time. So again, they focus on getting that local option in every state possible. Once they get that, they push for state prohibition, and then their ultimate goal is the national prohibition. They're very well organized, they're very well funded, and what they make extensive uses of is marketing and advertising. Tremendous amount of writings, billboards, posters. They bombard the country with this issue in a bunch of really creative and effective ways. For the most part, again, they're a narrow gauge strategy. This is the issue, prohibition. They tangentially are interested in some other issues related to that. They're certainly interested in enforcing their view of public morality. They're concerned about the family, but it's prohibition. But they very cleverly understand there's a connection between the suffragists, the women pushing for voting rights, and themselves. And they do make an alliance with those suffragist groups, particularly in the 20th century, understanding that many women supported temperance because it, again, particularly drunkenness among men affected women and family. They also understood if women got the right to vote, that they would likely vote for pro-prohibition legislation. And in many cases, they did. So that was a clever alliance, an important alliance. And first and foremost, what they use is pressure politics. They literally, in every state, would target individual legislators. They would bombard those people, mostly men, obviously, with letters, telegrams, visits, public demonstrations, and pressure them. Do you support this prohibition legislation or do you not? For those who supported their view, they got money and votes. They backed those candidates up 100%. For those who didn't, they would run primary candidates. They deny them the votes and the money. And this was incredibly effective. Just a couple of posters put out by the Anti-Saloon League. So on the left, some statistics. Again, 1 in 3 husbands divorced for cruelty was intemperate. Alcohol is an enemy to the home. So again, home defense. That's what they're after here. And on the right, again, it's sort of home defense, but it's the big liquor lobby too they're after. These businessmen, these immoral businessmen selling this poison that ultimately destroys men and destroys family. So vote dry. So by 1905, by that point, the Anti-Saloon League was really the primary driver of prohibition advocacy in the United States. You see particularly how widespread the local option was now. It was in most states, although just a few states have entirely gone dry. Lastly, let's throw in World War I. There's another factor which leads momentum to a national prohibition. Particularly once the country enters the war in 1917, there's a massive need for war production in factories and in farms. And certainly we can't have drunken workers getting hurt on the job, missing time. We need sober workers. So, many business interests get behind this too. And by the way, as they had even before, because they did prefer not drunken workers, but sober workers who were be more productive. So by the time we get to 1919, when national prohibition, the 18th Amendment, would be ratified, the point being, the country was already very far along that road. Most states were moving in that direction, even if they hadn't entirely outlawed the use and sale and production of alcohol. They were moving in that direction. So when the 18th Amendment was proposed, that would have been December 1917, it just took 13 months for the requisite number of states, 3/4, to ratify. The groundwork had already been laid. And so very, very quickly, the 18th Amendment came to be. 1920, the Volstead Act is passed by Congress, which is the enforcement legislation. And we have the national prohibition during the 20s into the early 30s. All right, I do have some selected works. I could send this to anybody who's interested, certainly. And this is not certainly a comprehensive list, but it's a few works you might be interested in. And that is all I have. Ending a little early here. But I would welcome questions. It's the best part for me is the questions.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Fran. That was really a wonderful presentation and gave us a view of something we've heard about, but not necessarily understood the details of it. So that was great. We have a number of questions of people asking things about enforcement, for instance, as you said. You gave us a lot of background on who supported the idea of legislation and so on. But what about enforcement? Was there a great difference either in parts of the country or in, rural versus urban or in particular ethnic areas or anything like that in terms of the enforcement of these regulations?
Yeah, so, one of the big difficulties of enforcement was obviously compliance. Laws are obviously easier to enforce if most people are in compliance to begin with. But that was going to be a problem when it came to prohibition because so many people still wanted alcohol. The other was cost. Think of obviously the parallels, the war on drugs. Think of how much money the country has spent to, end illicit drug usage, particularly since the Nixon administration, which is really when the war on drugs began. We spent billions and billions and billions of dollars, and obviously, whatever statistics one looks at, we haven't solved the problem, not even close. And certainly that would have been the case even in the 19th century. Enforcement was expensive, and people were simply not going to, pay for enforcement. That would have required hiring hundreds and thousands of people, and that wasn't going to happen either. But the main thing is you still have a large percentage of the population who wants to use these substances, and they're going to find the black market. And there are going to be people who provide them those substances, the alcohol they want.
We have another question related to enforcement in terms of how different that was for wealthy people versus working class people. We know, of course, that a lot of wealthy people would have wine cellars, or maybe would have chosen to stockpile, clean out the local liquor store before the law came into effect. And we're assuming that there were no government agents going around and checking people's basements or wine cellars. But of course, somebody living in a small apartment in a city doesn't have that luxury. They don't have a wine cellar. They don't have a basement to stockpile things.
Right.
So what sort of differences did we view by social class at the time?
Yeah, I mean, temperance has always, and prohibition has always had this class struggle to some extent. It is largely the middling and upper classes trying to impose their view of morality, if you will, on the working class and the poor. And that goes back to the beginning of this movement in the 19th century. There always is that tension. And clearly the wealthy they were better connected. I'm sure they were able to more evade the law if they had to, or be left alone, than the poor were. The poor had no strings they could pull. They had nobody they could go to if somebody wanted to try to enforce the law against them. So,
well, there's a related question about that, sort of an urban legend that the White House during Prohibition had, with I guess what would have been Wilson and Harding as president, if they had access to alcohol or used it in some way that obviously would not be accessible to your average American.
Yeah, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on Harding's administration, but that is the story, that Harding freely served alcohol, in the White House. It was not really a secret.
It's kind of your ultimate irony, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
Enforcement, and we're assuming no agent came in and confiscated it, right? So
exactly.
That's always interesting to hear. We have another question about just the social implications of having alcohol not served in saloons, local bars, whatever. That, as you said, a lot of immigrants were coming over at the time. And in some areas, particularly Ireland, England, Scotland, the local pub is really a social kind of connection for the community where people go. And even if they're not necessarily concerned about consuming a lot of alcohol, it's a place where people connect with others. They find out about what's going on in the local community. It's before internet, of course, and even television. So do you have any idea what sort of consequences there were in terms of these social connections? Did the local saloon just close down, or would they go underground in the so-called speakeasy and serve the same function, or how did that all work out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if I have enough background to fully answer that. I could only speculate, but I'm sure some of them did go underground and, discreetly sell the stuff. It's possible some just didn't, sell alcohol, but I don't know how they would stay in business in that, that's largely how they made their business. In Ireland, until fairly recent years, people went mostly to drink in pubs. It was when the Irish government began to realize what an alcoholic problem they had is they began to push those pubs to become more family-centered, more social-centered, and serve more food, and not simply be a place where men went to drink, extensively. So beyond that, I don't know in the United States if it was the same sort of pattern. I'm sure some of those places did go out of business, if they couldn't serve alcohol, but I'm not sure. But that's a really good question.
They probably wouldn't make the same profit margin if they just sold coffee and tea or soft drinks and so on. Right?
Consider too,
ice cream parlors.
Exactly. The amount of tax revenue that governments lost when they outlawed alcohol too. That was another factor. That was actually one reason Prohibition was repealed during the Depression. These states were losing a tremendous amount of tax revenue that they had been getting before Prohibition through selling alcohol.
At a time when they needed it most, right?
Exactly.
Because of the Depression and so on. So yeah, I could see that would be a real concern. We have some other questions about, again, a lot of these urban legends that emerge about, for instance, the development of crime. I think one of the justifications of Prohibition was that it would lower crime rates and we wouldn't have to worry quite so much about all of the different kinds of crimes people commit. But then, of course, organized crime became stronger during this. Is there any basis to think those urban legends are true or?
Yes. I mean, they both are. It's on the one hand, organized crime did flourish because you have an incredibly lucrative product that a lot of people still want. It becomes illegal, and there are people who are going to supply that product, at a price, obviously, and people who made tremendous amounts of money doing so. On the other hand, there is a lot of evidence to suggest, for example, drinking rates declined in the United States substantially during Prohibition. Actually, there are some statistics to show American health improved. Absenteeism and injuries on the job decreased, which were some of the goals actually of Prohibition. Some of those goals were to some extent achieved, not 100% obviously, but there were actually some beneficial aspects to Prohibition. But on the other hand, you have the problems that emerge too.
We have some other questions about the sort of workarounds that might occur during Prohibition. For example, you mentioned that alcohol could still be used for medicinal purposes. And we saw certainly recently with marijuana use that it first became legal for people who were taking it with a prescription. And then, of course, in other states became legal recreationally. Did we see a huge increase maybe in people getting prescriptions for, I don't know, brandy or something like that was going to cure their whatever medical condition was being a concern at the time?
I don't know, honestly. I wouldn't be surprised. And certainly, there were abuses along those lines. One other exemption during Prohibition was church wine, wine, alcohol used for religious purposes, but particularly church wine. That would be another exemption.
Yeah. And we have some other questions again about these workarounds. We also hear a lot of stories about bathtub gin and homemade stills, moonshiners, speakeasies, all these other ways that people might consume alcohol or just actually create alcohol. It's not being sold by the bottle. So, people making it themselves. Is there any truth in that, or how does that all?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I actually years ago I had students interview older relatives who remembered some of this, or maybe heard it from parents or what have you. And there were a number of stories, particularly among immigrant families, it seems, of people who made their own alcohol. But in most cases, they weren't selling. They were simply making it for their own use, their own families. But there were so many ways, if not making it, to get it, obviously, during Prohibition. It was available still. It could be smuggled into the country. It wasn't that difficult to get if one wanted it.
Right. Well, even wasn't there an increase in the sale of grape juice? Could be
Yes.
easily fermented, or giving
Yes.
people instructions on how to ferment it within certain temperature conditions and length of time, and when it would turn to wine and so on.
Yeah, all sorts of things can be made in alcoholic beverages. Exactly. It's not that
So
hard.
people found a way to deal with the restrictions and create it themselves. Right?
And of course, another negative aspect of prohibition was the moonshine. The number of people who died of poison, alcoholic poisoning, because there were no controls on this illegal alcohol. So that was another downside to prohibition.
We have a question about the ratification of prohibition. I believe it was, because there were 48 states at the time, not 50. Was ratified by 46, I believe, Connecticut and Rhode Island being the two holdouts. Can you speak about that and whether or not that affected the local governments willing to enforce it?
Yeah, it probably would. That's a really good point. Exactly. The national prohibition was obviously the national government under the Volstead Act was responsible for enforcement. But just as we see with a lot of national laws, that really utterly depended on state support and state assistance. So if that wasn't there, it was almost impossible to enforce.
Yeah. And we have another question about differences in other countries. We have countries like Canada or Australia or whatever that had a similar immigration situation at the time and had some of the same religious groups that ended up spearheading prohibition in the US. Did we see similar prohibition movements in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, any of these other countries that typically were getting some of the same changes in social patterns that the US experienced?
That's beyond my pay grade, honestly. But one thing I certainly, temperance and abolitionism were broad movements in the Western world. They weren't unique to the United States. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization, particularly between what was going on in Britain and here. And that would be true for other social movements such as abolitionism, women's rights, and so forth. But the details of how that manifested itself in other countries, I'd really have to look that up. I'd be speculating.
And of course, in some ways, the U.S. was, or U.S. individuals were importing alcohol from Canada and the Caribbean and so on, right? I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
Not legally, of course, but
right.
We're getting access that way.
That's right.
Neighboring countries made it easy that way. So you look at that.
Yeah, rum from the Caribbean or from Canada or what have you. Exactly.
Now, we have some people commenting on the fact that there are dry communities today, I guess, still in the U.S. Is that right?
Yes. I could pull a map up if I happen to think of that. This is fairly recent. So that option still exists in many states. Let me see if I can just pull that up quickly. This is from 2019. It's as recent as I could find. But the red counties are dry counties. And you see it's mostly sort of the Ohio Valley, Mississippi Valley, just a few counties farther west. And the yellow have some restrictions, which would vary from place to place. The blue are wet. So Connecticut actually, you might recall this, until 2014, the town of Bridgewater was dry. That was the last town in Connecticut that was dry. 2014, there was a referendum in the town where the citizens agreed to end those restrictions.
And we had another question about what happened when Prohibition was repealed. Was that a smooth process of things just going back to the way they were, or did that lead to other types of restrictions that were put in place?
Largely a return of the status quo. It was, so far as I know, fairly smooth. there was a great desire to do that at that point.
Yeah, and we seem to see restriction, obviously by age, and then
right.
by time of, I mean, we're all, I'm guessing, having the experience of being in a local grocery store at 8 o'clock or whatever the time is, and they stop serving at certain times or certain days of the week. I mean, for a while, Sundays, for instance, people weren't serving alcohol, or were there a lot of those laws then came into place, more specifically about controlling who can buy alcohol or where? Or,
I dare say yes, and I'm sure it would have varied widely from state to state, place to place. And yeah, it is an interesting set of laws in Connecticut. The no alcohol sales on Sunday was largely, and it still is to some, although that's gone. That was really to prop up the small mom and pop liquor stores here against larger corporate entities that could sell alcohol, larger varieties of it, perhaps at a lower price. So it was really to prop them up. Really served no other purpose. I mean, it was sort of nominally tied to religion or something, but it was really just that.
Yeah, and it seems to have had that effect, right? So,
yes.
We have another question about one of the data points you gave about the average use of, I think it was about 14, 15 ounces a day for Americans. Do you have any idea how that worked out in terms of whether there was a huge amount of people having, 64 or 120 ounces a day, and a lot of people having none, or any ideas how that might?
Yeah, I mean, it's an average, it's a mean, so I dare say you're right. There would have been some people who were teetotalers, so it's even more astonishing the amount that the people who were hardcore alcoholics must have consumed. It's just an astonishing amount of alcohol.
And then some of that we presume changed because of also the health concerns, as you said, no FDA and all that kind of thing before then. People didn't, we're assuming people didn't have the same concerns about the quality of the water they were drinking or other beverages they might have that, originally were around when people were consuming those huge amounts. Is that right?
Right, because there were really no regulations or social controls to speak of. That really wouldn't happen until, nationally, it wouldn't happen until the very early 20th century. On the state level, some of it would have happened a little earlier, but not in the early 19th century. So people really had no idea what they were getting.
We have another sort of urban legend here. I don't know if anyone knows if it's true or not, but supposedly the town of Westport never enforced prohibition in terms of going in and raiding any of these sites that might be serving alcohol. In the state of Connecticut, about anything about the enforcement at the local level, if there were places that just sort of turned a blind eye, or what all happened?
Again, I don't know specifically, but it would have really depended on the town government, the people, the will to do this, exactly. I dare say enforcement was probably more rigorous in cities because, again, there you have immigrants who are sort of the target of this anyway to some extent. We want to get them under control. We don't want them running around the streets drunk, missing work, and so forth.
And I think we have time for just one more question. So I'll ask this one about, you mentioned the social movements of women's suffrage, prison reform, abolition, and so on being related to the temperance movement. Once prohibition was passed, did that have the desired effect? Well, obviously slavery was no longer an issue when it was passed, but for women's suffrage, was there prison reform, that occurred because there was no longer an issue in alcohol, or was that just some sort of dream people had that never occurred?
Well, I think the latter. I think it's still something we struggle with. There was some change, but in terms of prison, and particularly prisoner reform, the debate, I think, still goes on. It's between rehabilitation and punishment. And we still go back and forth with that. Are prisons places where people are there to be punished, or are they there to be rehabilitated? And I think depending on your point of view will influence, you know, the sort of institution one builds and how much money perhaps one plows into it.
Right, and sort of this expected nirvana that there would be no crime and we wouldn't need
Right.
prisons. Unfortunately, that never happened.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. And we go back and forth with that too. Do we even want to institutionalize people? Right?
If that's what people were saying, you know, would reform prisons by eliminating crime, then that would have been very nice. But
there was a move for, there was a sense and it was a really Christian impulse that these people, first of all, are fellow human beings, fellow Christians, we assume, and they can be saved. They can, in a secular sense, they can be redeemed, they can be saved. But we need to build a sort of institution where that's possible, and then they can be safely released to the public. But even short of that, the impulse, Dorothea Dix was certainly instrumental in this, was to make these places more humane, because they were, you know, incredibly inhumane places, as arguably they still are.
Right. Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time, so I'm going to have to say goodbye to you, Fran. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And
Thank you.
Goodbye to all of our wise women, and hope to see you all soon. So that would be the end of things for today. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.